Thank you, Catherine, for that overly generous introduction. As the Chinese would say, 不敢当. I'm not sure I live up to them. I'm very happy to have you here today and to share a few insights on the Yijing, the Book of Changes. When I first studied Chinese philosophy as an undergraduate, I was introduced to the key areas of philosophy: Confucianism, Taoism, and then Buddhism as a later addition. Buddhism was first introduced into China about the 1st century AD and never really took off until the 4th century AD. And in some ways is still not considered by some people, some scholars within China, as an indigenous Chinese philosophy, because of course it came from India. However, Confucianism and Taoism are very much indigenous Chinese philosophies. It was only much later in my academic career when I started research on a book, Introduction to Chinese Philosophy. I gave it to a senior professor who works at the University of Hawaii to read my, chapter outline, and he said, "Why is there no mention of the Yijing? Don't you know the Yijing is, at the core, at the basis of all Chinese philosophy?" I went, "Really? Are you superstitious or something?" I kept those thoughts to myself because in my mind, having grown up in Singapore, the Yijing was something very, very distant. I grew up in a Christian family. The Yijing was something very distant, something that people who perhaps prayed and worshipped at Taoist temples would come into contact with. And in my mind, it was associated with fortune telling and divination. Will my son pass the exams? Yes or no? And that's when the Yijing pronouncements come into effect. But this professor said to me, no, the Yijing has many, many layers. It has many, many layers. And later on, and I'll take you through some of these layers, later on, through the progression of Chinese history, Chinese scholars started thinking, why this book, the Yijing? Why this text? Why do the Chinese think this way? Why was there a need even for the Book of Change? And what is the meaning behind this attention on change? As a philosopher trained at the National University of Singapore, my education was very eclectic, so I was exposed to both Western and Chinese and indeed Indian philosophy as well. And so it was a really eye-opening and insightful exercise for me then to learn about this basis of why the Yijing and compare that with some of the questions the ancient Greeks were asking. And I'll share with you some of those insights. This is just a page from the book, The Yijing. The oldest layers of the Yijing were supposedly composed at around 1000 BC. And they comprised of trigrams. These are hexagrams, so 6 lines each. You see, they're made either of broken or unbroken lines. But these are 8, you have examples here of the 8 hexagrams, but they started off with 8 trigrams. So you see here 3 unbroken lines, 3 broken lines. So if you cut each hexagram into half, so by some permutation and combination of the trigrams, you stack them on top of each other to make hexagrams. In the end, you get 64 hexagrams. So these are just a sample of 8 of those. And you might have seen these at various points on websites if you've looked up the Yijing. That's the 64 combinations and permutations. And the full lines and the broken lines represent something in themselves. More importantly, though, they represent something different when put in the context of each of these hexagrams. So a whole line, for instance, may mean one thing in this context, but a whole line right at the top in this context, in combination with broken and unbroken lines in a particular order, could mean something quite different. And here is the start of what I think is the focus on change, is an emphasis on plurality. There is so many. The early Chinese didn't start with thinking the world was one. In contrast, the dominant Greek tradition, the pre-Socratic thinkers, the thinkers before Socrates, were constantly asking the question, what is the one thing that makes up the universe? They didn't, the one thing that makes up everything. Some suggested water, some suggested air, but they looked for the one constituent thing of all matter. The Chinese didn't assume there was one. To them, the world was plurality. When you begin with the belief that the world is comprised of plurality, you will immediately attune yourself to change. Because there are so many, these many will affect each other, and of course there will be change. So whether you take it as a tree, an individual, your health, your personal development, and so on and so forth, everything must be seen in the context of what is going to affect you. Like each of these lines, broken or unbroken, yes, there is you, there is a personal identity, but put you in a different context, you might be quite a different person. So that's the focus and the emphasis on change. And as I mentioned before, the contrast with the questions the early Greek philosophers were asking, the Greek philosophers of a similar time period, they were quite different questions. They were interested in finding the one, but these ones were interested in focusing on the plurality, and how then do we work with this plurality. Here is here is a page from the Yijing. Some of you who are familiar with the even contemporary practice of Chinese religion will come across this. Of course, an English translation. This symbol hexagram with 6 unbroken lines is the symbol for heaven. And so the text, the Yijing itself, goes through meticulously explaining the meaning of each single hexagram. So this is the explanation of the philosophy behind heaven. Heaven is known as the creative. Following this, which I'll show you on the next slide, is the judgment. So this is the judgment from heaven. So if you've gone to a temple to pray, to ask about your son or daughter's success in the exams, if you get this, definitely it's success. Okay, so these are the judgments that come through, and the Yijing hence plays still a very prominent role in the lives of Taoist believers today. And if you know anything about the lay practice of Chinese religions today, it can be extremely syncretic. What I mean by syncretic is that you walk into a temple, you say it's a Taoist temple, but sometimes you can find the figure of Confucius there. Sometimes when you say it's a Buddhist temple, you could find the figure. So it's all very mixed in and accommodating rather than exclusive, rather than this is Taoist and definitely not Buddhist. It doesn't work that way. It's all quite mixed in. So if you know a little bit about contemporary religious practice, you might come across this when people go for fortune telling. This was the part I was, in my mind, disparaging. The good catch might be the most memorable bit of the talk. Thank you, Benedict. So, no, I think it's the legs that need a bit of a... So I disparaged this. I thought it's just superstition and it's just fortune telling. There's nothing much to the Yijing after all. It can't be considered philosophy. This is not philosophy. This is just superstition. But let me take you back a little bit to the Chinese character Yi and its meaning so that we can understand their preoccupation with change. From the character, the bone inscriptions around the 14th to 11th centuries BC, there are various permutations and combinations of how the character was written. I'll just run through these slides fairly quickly. And then the character continued to develop around 1000 to 500 BC. And then much more recently, when the Chinese character stabilized, Chinese writing, the script stabilized at around 200 BC with the first emperor. Oh, thanks, Benedict. The character E stabilized to something like this. And in a dictionary, the earliest dictionary that has this character, it says it's in the shape of a chameleon. It's like a gecko lizard. Why? Because they represent change. It's very interesting that around this, earliest dictionary that we have, published about 121 AD or CE, as we now call it, the Common Era, there were, they noticed the chameleon, the gecko lizard, they noticed how the lizard changes colors, how it adapts to the environment. This is like a chameleon. It's, in terms of its pictograph, it's got the character of the sun here on top, like the moon. It's like yin and yang, it changes in a day. The character, very interestingly, while it has the meaning of change, it also has the meaning of easy. Easy. So perhaps there's the assumption that change comes easy, so beware. Change is easy, it happens. This citation is from a layer that was added to the Yijing around 200 BC. So if you have, I'll show you a copy of the Yijing that I have in an English translation. So in ancient times in China, texts were added to layers after layer, commentaries were added to the text, so that the text we now read, oftentimes you find many layers through it. And this layer was added about 200 BC. And this is the stuff that this very notable scholar pointed out to me. His name is Professor Chung-Ying Cheng. He pointed out to me, he said, this is the sort of stuff that's significant because that's when the Chinese started reflecting on their practices. They started reflecting why the Yijing, why focus on change. And so the master said, the master is presumably Confucius. So this is obviously someone belonging to the Confucian tradition, writing back, reminiscing about what Confucius might have said. Confucius lived about 500 BC, so this is about 300 years on. It wouldn't have been accurate. It's just someone within the tradition saying, the old master said. Master said, to get into danger is a matter of thinking one's position secure. To become ruined is a matter of thinking one's continuance protected. To fall into disorder is a matter of thinking one's order enduring. The Chinese have an ancient proverb that it is wise always to expect change coming out from this philosophy. If you are complacent, danger will befall you. Therefore, the noble man, when secure, does not forget danger. When enjoying continuance, does not forget ruin. When maintaining order, does not forget disorder. This is the way his person is kept secure and his state remains protected. Now, this was obviously written at a time when the emperors were very, very insecure about their maintenance of power and stability. So this would have been written by someone who was a court official, addressing the issue of court stability and state, the order of the state. So it draws from the ancient wisdom of the Book of Changes. It says, the Book of Changes says, this might be lost, this might be lost. So tie it to a healthy, flourishing mulberry. In other words, because change is imminent, because we always need to watch out, look out for something that is more secure, against which you can anchor whatever issue, topic you're talking about. Look for something more secure so that upon which you can feel that stability is ensured. So, tied to a healthy, flourishing mulberry, and we know mulberries can live for years. This caught my attention. This caught my attention because it reflected a fear about instability, an expectation that things might change. So we ask, what can we do with it? Earlier on, I showed you that the picture of the hexagrams, and that it's the ancient Chinese started with plurality. Because everything is closely connected, when one thing changes, it can affect other things. And because there are always so many things around us, you can easily be affected. I'll just point to several aspects of early Chinese philosophy to show you how this idea is revealed and manifests in them. So you have the Chinese 5 elements, the Wu Xing. And again, it shows a plurality. It's not one, it's not molecules, nor is it atoms, but it's 5 different sorts of things. And they interact, and depending on whether you have excesses or shortages of various elements, then it's an imbalance, and you need to then address that imbalance. It starts off with these 5 elements. When you look at the medical classic of the Yellow Emperor, this was a text that was written about 100, 200 AD, the Huangdi Neijing. It's a text about how the emperor, it's a very, very interesting text. It is about the emperor's health, but it's also about the health of the country. And they draw all sorts of analogies. When you think about it, what sort of legitimate analogy can you get from a person's health as compared with the order and disorder in a state? Nothing much, really. But they drew very interesting connections. They talked about balances and imbalances. When there is a balance in your body of yin and yang, it's a healthy body. When there's an imbalance, when you're lacking particular elements, then it's unhealthy. Look at your state. Are there imbalances that the emperor ought to focus on? You see, ultimately, if you focus on harmony and balances, you begin to see that you can learn from different layers and domains of life, that if there are imbalances, how do we go about addressing them? How do we go about treating them? If you know even the most, if you have even a little bit of knowledge of Chinese medicine, you'll know that it's not about giving remedies to illnesses, but really it's about balancing what's in the body. And more importantly than that, it's also about understanding each person's body in relation to their environment. So a person might have a particular constitution that makes them, quite healthy living in the Sydney climate. You put them in the Melbourne climate, they'll not feel very well. And you think, well, this is Chinese folk wisdom, but you hear even people from European civilizations. The climate didn't suit them there, so they moved over there. It's a widespread belief, and the Chinese recognized it very early on and, put into words and tried further to understand it. When you think about martial arts as well, and I have a little quote from the Art of War text later on, it's also about understanding the environment, understanding the opponent. There are now many good translations of the Art of War that are quite interesting, but there are also very many misappropriations of the Art of War that apply to understanding your enemy in the business context. See, in these corporate wars. But a lot of it, if you read the classical text of of the classical translations of the art of war, they're quite interesting. They're about understanding the environment, the enemy, who are you fighting, understanding your own capacities, and so on and so forth. So it's never really simply about inward looking. It's not merely about looking at yourself. It's understanding yourself and understanding the environment around. I love this passage. It's from a very, very old text, the Zuozuan. And to me, it crystallizes the idea of what it means to be an individual in Chinese philosophy. Harmony may be illustrated by soup. How? You have the water and fire, vinegar, pickle, salt, and plums, with which to cook fish. It is made to boil by the firewood, and then the cook mixes the ingredients, harmoniously equalizing the several flavors so as to supply whatever is deficient and carry off whatever is in excess. A beautifully made dish. Master Chef is happening there. We can all become the expert tasters after this. Beautifully made dish has the right amount of everything. Supposing we talk about vinegar. If you have an excess of vinegar, you can't drink the soup. If you have too little, you feel as if something is not quite right. But let's take the vinegar itself. Let's take the vinegar itself. As a standalone, a pot of vinegar, it means nothing. It is a pot of vinegar. Can you eat it in and of itself? I don't think we try. Or we could try, but stop very quickly after that. Its manifestations in certain contexts of different dish is what allows a good vinegar truly to manifest its properties. In and of itself, nothing much. Well, you could still say it's a good vinegar, but you wouldn't go trying spoon after spoon. You might have a little taste. And to me, this captures the essence of the idea of personhood in early Chinese philosophy, where standalone, you're nothing much. But within a harmonious whole, you can really blossom and manifest your properties and your characteristics and your best qualities. You can overdo it. There can be too much vinegar, or there can be too little. But it's about how you manifest your characteristics in the environment. And is the vinegar lost? No, the vinegar is not lost. There have been quite a few sociological and anthropological studies about the notion of self in Confucian culture, and about how this notion of self sometimes is lost, is subdominated by the idea of harmony, people having to give in. I'm sure that happens, and I'm sure that happens everywhere in the world. This domination of particular genders, particular sets of people, and so on and so forth. But I think within Chinese culture, it's not that the individual is lost, because if you take the vinegar out, the soup doesn't taste as nice. The soup calls out for vinegar. It's not lost. You know when it's missing. So what can be done about change? And here I'll talk very quickly through some of the classical Chinese philosophies and how they suggest that we deal with change. In Confucianism, as we know, there's a focus on relationships. Why relationships? Because all around you, if the world is changing, if you don't know how you approach family members, if you don't know how you approach strangers, how are you going to proceed in life? Family relationships is what gives you stability. Hence, in Confucianism, you anchor, remember, tied to a healthy, flourishing mulberry tree. The healthy, flourishing mulberry tree for Confucianism is good, strong relationships. Because in times of trouble, these are the people who will vouch for you. They will stand up for you and they will help you. So This is Confucian philosophy in the ideal. Again, I recognize that they have been taken to, a nasty extreme where sometimes children are, forced to do things that they don't want to do. And some of the criticisms of Ming and Qing dynasty China are spot on. But what I want to show you is that there is an ideal side to it, and in my mind, the early Confucians were quite idealistic. They thought about relationships as stabilizing factors in human life. What helped to promote the idealism, I think, is Confucius didn't think, what if someone had an aggressive father? Okay, and we know that we do, from time to time come across cases of aggressive fathers. I think they were too idealistic to carry their thought through further along. But I think in its idealism, that's the focus on relationships. In Taoism, what can be done about change? Well, we harmonize it. So Taoism doesn't see change as a bad thing. In fact, in one of the streams of Taoism, Zhuangzi, in a slightly later text of Taoist philosophy, they emphasize the expectancy of change and being prepared for change. And this is encapsulated in the yin-yang picture, as you know, the black and white picture. But let me take you through to the meaning of the picture. Sure, the yin-yang wants to emphasize a balance of yin and yang, captured in this case by the black and white. Why is the yin-yang diagram not just a straight division of black and white? Why is it not straight down? This is too static. It doesn't capture the change, the imminent change. Therefore, we see this imminent change, the interaction between the black and the white. This captures the interactivity, the movement. Why not stop there? In the yin-yang symbol as we know it, there are two dots as well. A white dot with the black and a black dot with the white. So why not this? Shouldn't it be the case that where the black is weakest, the white gains foothold? Isn't that what we normally expect? Isn't that the case? Where the white is weakest, that's where the black manages to creep in. Instead, we have this diagram, which has the dot of black at the strongest point of the white. And the philosophy underlying the yin-yang diagram is this, that the contrast is greatest here, not there. It's not at the point where the white is weakest, but the point where the white is strongest that you have the greatest contrast. We put on a torch now, it won't have much effect. Put on that same torch in a pitch dark room. A celebration of contrast and complementation, rather than saying that, the opposite is what I don't want to know. I don't want to know about that because it's opposite to me. But really embracing contrast. So continuing the question about what can be done about change, this is a passage from The Art of War. And I find this quite interesting. So Sun Tzu said, in the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. So too, it's better to recapture an entire army than to destroy it. To capture a regiment, a detachment, or a company entire than to destroy them. And I like this last moral. Hence, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. If you read more of the text, well, it's still fighting, it's still war. But if you read the text, the focus is very much on understanding your opponent. Understanding your opponent in order to win. And we've heard in many treatises and books written since the September 11 event that the way the Western world deals with September 11 starts off with a failure to understand and a lack of understanding what instigated that war. The classical Chinese texts always say, first understand your opponents. It's not about, it doesn't say first build up your troops. You could build up your troops, but if you fail to understand your opponents, that's to no use. It is quite strategic, clever, I think, and quite knowing. It may not result in less bloodshed. So I'm not in any way promoting war or anything. I'm just trying to present to you a selection of texts where in each one of them you're able to see awareness of the environment, awareness of the other, the understanding of plurality rather than singularity. It's not just a me, me, me culture. It's where do I stand? Even in war, they ask, where do I stand? This is I'll end off with a lovely story about how we can deal with change. And I've got this story in a book I bought for my kids many years ago, The Master Swordsman. This is a few pages into the story already. You know, a group of robbers pillaged a village, and this little boy was very burdened by it. He went to this old Master Swordsman and says, I want to learn to teach. I want to learn to fight. So he comes to this old master to say, can you please teach me to fight? The master accepted him and said, okay, so, you know, I'll teach you how to fight. These are the chores you have to do. So these are the chores he had to do in his training. Never once did he touch a sword. So, you know, as in a storybook, in a children's storybook, pots being hurled at him, vegetables being thrown at him in every corner. And at first, he succumbed to all these, you know, he'd get hit. He got to a certain point where he actually learned to avoid them. At the end of the story, he's allowed to use the sword. And what he uses the sword for is chopping vegetables. Because what he's learned is to avoid. And indeed, this is one idea in martial arts, in a lot of Chinese martial arts, is that the trick is not to actively harm your opponent, but to move so quickly and to avoid them so as you wear them out. You wear them out. They are, you know, losing a lot of energy trying to strike at you, but they haven't been able to strike at you. In the end, who's lost out? They fall flat because they've lost energy. And finally, I've put in some things we can learn from Chinese philosophy. Be an attentive observer. You can always learn from others. Confucius famously, in one passage in his saying, said, you never just learn from the good, you learn from the bad as well. You learn from what they do and you don't do them, but you don't just say this is good, this is good. But sometimes when I think about the way we have our moral education, when we do something, we learn on the run our morality, I think. When you do something bad, you get reprimanded. Often we're not told why. You know, of course, as adults, we start thinking through things. But there are many more ways in which we are told just to do good, and not given not given enough examples of immoral behavior and taken through carefully to explain why they are immoral. Think critically and reflect, never just copy. So look at others and think about what they're doing. Think about why this behavior is approved of. Think of why someone has got accolades. Think of why someone has received a Medal of Australia award. Why? What have they done? What is the significance? Never just copy. I don't think you're going to get a medal from just copying. Understand that the development of skills requires much practice and discipline, and this is evidence in all of in Chinese martial arts, in the Chinese attitude to life, in the Chinese attitude even to eating. Health doesn't come by in just one day. The food that you put in you comes from the environment. That affects your body. It is something that health is a long-term issue. It's never something that you think, oh, I'll just indulge today and, suffer the consequences tomorrow. It's a long-term issue. It requires much practice and it requires much discipline. Hence, you've got in Chinese culture emphasis on the martial arts, on good health, and so on and so forth. Never to be acquired through, a short period of time. Try not to be too rigid. It's often a mistake to think that one size fits all. This comes directly, particularly from Taoist philosophy. Don't think, always expect change. Don't think that what suits you is going to suit someone else. In particular, be very, very aware of the environment around you. Think about it. Think about who you are in relation to the other people around you, in relation to your environment and what sort of impact you make. Always think of the wider consequences. Thank you.